My name is Wesley Merritt, and this is my research video project. I will be talking about the Freedmen's Bureau and how essential they were in the Reconstruction era in America. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the United States was kind of in ruins. The war had torn the country apart, but it also marked the beginning of something new, a transformational period in American history. Slavery was abolished, but there was a lot of freedom without support. Millions of newly freed African Americans had nothing, no land, no education, no homes, and often no protection. That's why the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau was so essential in American history. Formerly known as the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, this group played a crucial role in the Reconstruction era. It wasn't just helpful, it was also vital. It offered a lifeline to people trying to survive and rebuild their lives in a country still deeply hostile to their existence. It was established in March of 1865, right as the war was coming to a close. The Freedmen's Bureau was put under the leadership of Union General Oliver O. Howard. The mission had a lot of goals and was incredibly ambitious. It was meant to help freedmen transition from slavery to freedom and to stabilize the South in the process. In many ways, the Bureau became the government's most direct attempt to support Black Americans in this transformative time. The need was overwhelming. After the war, the South was in ruins, both physically and economically. Millions of former slaves had been emancipated, but with no resources or protections. Many were left vulnerable to exploitation, poverty, and violence. The Bureau stepped to fill that gap. The Bureau stepped in to fill that gap, to try at least, to make freedom more than something just a word or a concept. They were trying to make it into a reality. One of the earliest and boldest efforts was in land redistribution. General Howard's Circular Number 13, which was issued in July of 1865, ordered the redistribution of confiscated Southern land to freedmen. This is where the famous phrase, 40 acres and a mule, came from, an idea that captured the hopes of freed people across the entire South. The Bureau attempted to give them land, the most basic building block of economic independence. But in most cases, this promise was broken. Land was returned to former Confederates, and very few freedmen actually received what they were promised. Still, I think the effort itself revealed just how essential the Bureau was in trying to correct centuries of injustice. Even in failure, it was an attempt to give freed people a real chance at building a new life. Education was another area where the Bureau made an enormous and lasting impact. Working with Northern Aid societies, the Bureau helped establish more than 4,000 schools across the South for freedmen and their children. This was not a small feat. It was one of the largest educational efforts in American history at that time. Education opened doors. It gave Black Americans the tools to participate in democracy, to read contracts, to write letters, to learn history. In a time of sweeping change, it offered the foundation for a just future. Of course, these efforts weren't welcomed by everyone. The historian Mary Farmer Kaiser writes about how schools were often met with violence by white Southerners who feared Black education would upset the racial order. Teachers were attacked. Schoolhouses were burned, but the Bureau, alongside the communities it served, refused to back down. Healthcare was also part of the Bureau's mission. More than 40 hospitals were opened, serving thousands of freed people who had never had access to proper medical care. According to scholar J. Thomas May, the Bureau's healthcare programs were among the first major federal efforts to provide medical services to African Americans. Again, this was more than helpful. It was essential, especially in the region still reeling from war and widespread disease. Another cornerstone of the Bureau's work was labor. It helped freedmen negotiate contracts with employers, attempting to protect them from the return of exploitative practices that resembled slavery. For example, the Jim Crow laws. While enforcement varied and racism often got in the way, the Bureau's role as a legal advocate gave free people some sense of protection and some leverage in a system that stacked against them. We can see this in documents like the 1866 Certificate of Land issued to James Hicks, a concrete example of freedmen receiving legal recognition of property ownership. We also see it in the Bureau's marriage records. Enslaved people had been denied the right to marry, but through the Bureau, couples could finally legalize their unions. The 1865 Register, complied by John Barnett, helped thousands of people formalize their families, gaining rights and stability in the eyes of the law. Despite all of these achievements, the Bureau's work was consistently under attack. President Andrew Johnson vetoed the key Bureau bills, arguing that its mission was unnecessary and unconstitutional. Though Congress managed to override some of his vetoes, the political resistance took a toll. The Bureau was never given enough resources. It was understaffed, underfunded, and often overwhelmed. It also faced violent resistance from groups like the Ku Klux Klan, who viewed its efforts as a threat to white supremacy. In states like Florida, as historian Joe Richardson has shown, freed people's rights were regularly ignored or undermined, even with the Bureau present. By 1872, just 7 years after the Bureau began, the Freedmen's Bureau was shut down. But the legacy left behind was undeniable. It helped lay groundwork in concrete for a building for institutions like Howard University. It proved that the federal government could, and sometimes must, play a direct role in supporting civil rights. And it showed that what was possible when a nation tries to correct its wrongs, even imperfectly. W.E.B. Du Bois once called the Freedmen's Bureau a noble but tragically flawed experiment. It was both a beacon of hope and a reminder of how deeply rooted racism was, and still is. But at its heart, the Bureau played an essential part in Reconstruction. It provided housing, education, legal support, medical care, and a sense of protection to millions of people navigating freedom for the first time. It didn't fix everything immediately, but it made a start. It laid down the groundwork for essential civil rights movements. It offered real, tangible support at a time when that support meant everything. The Freedmen's Bureau reminds us that change is hard but necessary, along with the fact that when things are hard, they are not impossible. And even when the effort is incomplete, the attempt to build something better matters. This was my presentation on the Freedmen's Bureau and how essential they were during Reconstruction.